the Abbasid revolutionaries had used the term Imam, and that's true of the Zaydis as well, or other Shi'i opponents of the Umayyads, to say they use the term Imam to mean the person who ought to be caliph. So the person who, and it's in that sense that the Abbasids refer to their ruler as Imam. So it's both Imam and Caliph. So this is a moment where God's intentions for the world have actually been actioned. And these are very live issues as well, because al-Maʻmun issues coins in his own name as Imam al-Huda during the fourth Fitna. So Dionysius is essentially adapting and reusing Maʻmun's own political language back to him in order to present himself as a fellow Imam and therefore shore up his own authority. So there's lots of different layers to this speech. Of course, it's Dionysius' speech to Maʻmun. We don't know what he really said, but this is what he wants to be thought to be saying this. And it's part of his display of how well he knows a Muslim context. So he's showing a Christian audience how well he knows that context.
Peace, everyone, and welcome back to another installment of the Real Talk podcast. I'm your host, Terron, alongside my brilliant co-host, Roxanna. Today, we're diving into a fascinating conversation about Christian leadership under the Abbasid Caliphate with Professor Philip Wood. His book, The Imam of the Christians, The World of Dionysius of Tel-Mahre, 750 to 850, explores how Christian leaders navigated and adapted to the political landscape of their Muslim rulers. By focusing on Dionysius of Tel-Mahre, if I'm even saying that correctly, the patriarch of the Jacobite Church, Wood examines how these interactions shaped an Islamicate Christianity distinct from the Christian traditions of Byzantium and Western Europe. So let's get into it. Your work engages deeply with the complex world of Middle Eastern Christianity under Abbasid rule, a history that is often overlooked or oversimplified. What initially drew you to this topic? Because, for myself, it was a new one. I've never actually considered the inner workings of the Christian communities under the Abbasid rule or under Muslim rule more broadly. So what got you into this topic?
Thanks very much for having me. I guess I started off, my PhD had been about late Roman Syria, and I'd become interested in how what we could call minority communities, how they react to different kinds of government. So how do governments deal with diversity, and how do the diverse populations respond to the different ways in which they might be governed? So I started off by looking at what we could say Miaphysite Christian populations in Syria and Mesopotamia, and thinking how are they treated by a government that thinks by a Christian government that deems them to be heretical. And my second book was asking similar kinds of questions about Christian populations in Iraq. So there you've got Zoroastrian rulers and Christian populations were non-Abrahamic political system. And then, so this was a sort of, it fits with the other books in a sense. So it pursues similar kinds of questions for Christians in the Caliphate. So that was one answer to your question. The other thing is I kind of got into Christian Arabic and the Abbasid context through looking at the Chronicle of Siirt, which had been my second book. So I pursued lots of ideas that had been expressed in Syriac, but then seemed to be best extant in Arabic. So there was lots of stuff that had been written around originally in Syriac, and then it sort of surfaces in Arabic. And it led me to think, actually, that it never made sense to look at Syriac on its own. You always had to look at it, if you were interested in political questions, you had to look at the Syriac sources alongside Arabic ones. And these were communities that were really using multiple languages facing in different directions. So that was, I guess that's one answer. And the other answer is, as I taught a lot of Islamic history, it struck me how much people told a story that was a story of the conquerors and the rulers. And I wanted to tell a story that was talking about the Christian majority, and because Christians are in a majority in the Levant until the 11th century at least. So I wanted to be able to tell that story of that population and how they adapted to the experience of going from being a majority ruling population to being at least a power minority, a population that's maybe still very populous, but is also being ruled by people who don't share their religion.
Yeah, because
Thanks, sorry, go ahead, yeah.
oh no, I was just gonna say, like you just mentioned, um, it's like, oh, sorry, like you just said, the Christian population under the Caliphate was something that I never even thought about. I mean, it's almost like Islam came, conquered a wide variety of the Middle East,
Mm.
and everything became Muslim.
Yep.
And then eventually, I come to find out, well, hey, Christian people didn't convert to Islam. The populations that the Muslims conquered didn't convert to Islam. Some of these places didn't see 50% Muslim until like 400 or 500 years later, which really makes you think like off the back of Christian Sonner's article, What is Islamic History? You know,
Mm.
Islamic history involves more than just the conquerors and the rulers, but also minority populations that also had to deal with, what came along with these conquerors and how to adapt to the new political and religious situation. So,
Absolutely. Yeah. So it fits, I guess, I'm interested in how empires behave. And in that sense, so my study of Christians in the Caliphate fits into that broader set of questions.
And so what made you decide to focus on sort of the Jacobite Patriarch Dionysius in particular? Because has he received much scholarly attention previously? And why do you think or not think this is the case? What made you decide to focus on him?
I mean, there's a certain amount of secondary literature, mostly in German. So there's not quite a biography, a study of Dionysius's work written in 1940 by a priest from Estonia, German background, ethnically German priest. He died during the Second World War. He died in a camp, I think, in Russia. So he never wrote any sort of follow-up studies. And then there were two PhD theses that used the work of Dionysius a great deal. And then there's been Andrew Palmer's work on the 7th century Syriac sources, uses Dionysius and attempts a kind of reconstruction of Dionysius into English. Two comments there. One is, I think that Dionysius doesn't exist. His work is not extant. I can't pick up a volume of Dionysius and say, I know that everything here is by Dionysius. It's more that we know that he's the key source for three later chronicles. So any statement attributing something to Dionysius involves an element of reconstruction.
Mm.
I would say that the material that we can be most sure about that it's Dionysian is the 9th century material. Certainly the 9th century, maybe the late 8th century as well. And when you see that when Dionysius dies, all these chroniclers who've been relying on him really have nothing to say about the late 9th century. The quantity, the amount of number of reports just drops off a cliff. So I'd say we can be fairly sure that Book 12 of Michael the Syrian is mostly Dionysius. But I'd say it's a much harder job to say that about the 7th century material. We know that Dionysius covers the 7th century in his history, but we can't be very sure about what he says. So in the end, I decided to focus my book on the material that we can be, where those source critical questions are not absent, but a bit easier. But the late 8th, 9th century, the first Abbasid century.
It's almost like you're saying earlier sources does not necessarily mean more authentic in
Oh,
that.
no. So more earlier sources, in a sense, there's more. So Dionysius is meant to have begun his history in the 850s and right almost up to the time of his death, so 842. And I would say for the earlier material, firstly, it's harder to work out what is by Dionysius, and secondly, there's much more incentive for invention, especially for someone who's so politically involved as Dionysius is, how he's going to tell like the story of Muhammad or the Islamic conquests is going to be much more kind of politicized. He's not going to be able to tell a plain, even if he knew the plain truth, he's not going to be able to tell it. So I wouldn't go to Dionysius for, I go to Dionysius for the Abbasid-Era reimagining of the 7th century. But I wanted to talk, I wanted to use Dionysius to write social history as well.
Mm.
That's why I homed in on the era of his own lifetime and his predecessors.
Okay, makes sense. You also discuss in your book how you try to avoid conflating the experiences of different Christian and Jewish confessions within the Caliphate.
Hmm.
How do the sources you rely upon enable you to achieve this?
Well, I feel that there's a strand of writing about, in particular, Muslim Christian relations or Muslim Christian Jewish relations that is not really interested in historical reconstruction and instead wants to make kind of essentialist generalizations and say, are Muslims tolerant or not?
Mhm.
Which is a stupid question
Right.
because human beings are all different and they operate in lots of different contexts. And the only motivating factor for one person's actions is not going to be some idealized notion of Islam. So it's to strip away that kind of approach for one. Also, I mean, we've got different kinds of sources for different communities. So my approach has really relied on using it's a historiographical approach. It looks at layering in chronicles to see how one generation talks about the past and how it differs from how another generation talks about it. The different kinds of ways that people have to use the past. And you need to know that before you can read chronicles properly. And then to combine that with things like canon law and saints' lives. But you can't take that kind of approach for Jewish sources because the Jewish sources are very rich, but tell you different kinds of things.
Like,
Um,
just to give an example.
well, so a lot of it is rulings by the Gaonica, by the Gaonim. So they're providing rulings based on the Talmud or how the Talmud should be implemented
Mm,
into social behavior. But they're not going to. It's you can't go to those rulings for a kind of political narrative because it won't give you one.
okay.
So you can use Christian sources to write a kind of narrative history in a way that is harder for Jewish material.
You sort of you just touched on the fact that you identify in your introduction two recent developments in the study of religion as being particularly welcome. The first is kind of an anti-essentialist approach
Yeah,
to religious studies, and the other is an increasing attempt to sort of chart the shared cultural legacies of what we could term as the Muslim world and the West,
yeah,
which
yeah,
have become increasingly sort of dichotomized in popular discourse recently.
yeah.
Um, to what extent do these approaches obviously inform your own scholarship and the development of this book in particular? And why do you think these developments have come about?
Um, I'll try and answer the first question. I'm not sure I can answer the second one.
Okay.
Um, so I think a turn that's happened in some parts of North American religious studies that I think is very useful is firstly to see religion as something that's changing. It's a moving target, and it's formed that religions are generated by the seeing, say, Islam as a product of Muslims or Christianity as the product of Christians, rather than seeing it something that's set in stone and then transmitted. It's uh, it's a tradition. It's a discursive tradition that people have layer upon layer of discussion in subsequent generations, responding to different contexts, and people will add and subtract different things from that tradition that they've inherited, dependent on what they encounter. So there will be common kind of lodestones that people will come back to, and many Muslims will say, well, Quran and Sunnah sit at the center. But what Quran and Sunnah consist of will in practice differ greatly, even among ulama, let alone the general Muslim public. Or in a sense, all of those are worthy of study as students of religion or as historians. In a sense, the Islam or the Christianity of the insane or of children is just as important as that of ulama. They're all worthy of equal study. So it's not our job as historians to privilege one. Um, so that's one thing. So the religions are changing as particular categories, but also religions, I think, change as general categories, by which I mean the powerful get to set what religion in general looks like. So in the 19th century, that's British or American assumptions of their kind of imposing Protestant Christian norms onto Buddhist or Hindu or Muslim populations and saying, well, to be a real religion, you've got to have X, Y, and Z. And in the ninth century, those are Abbasid assumptions about what a real religion looks like that lead to certain forms of behavior being categorized as religion and others being categorized as culture. And it leads to a hierarchy in which certain forms of behavior are more justified and have to be respected, and other forms of behavior are kind of delegitimized. So there's a sort of general way in which that, this question about religion being defined in different ways, it also operates as how one religion self-defines will affect the others. You asked this question about the common fate of the so-called Muslim world and the so-called West. And I would see them all as inheritors of late antiquity, I guess. That is, all inheritors of an urban, complex society which engages monotheism in government. And to varying degrees, that's true of Iceland to Uzbekistan. And what we describe as the West, Richard Bullitt makes a really important point. He said that East and West, these are arbitrary points. North and South, we can say, right, you're getting hotter or colder. There's sort of climatic variation. But East and West, it depends on the viewer. You can set the boundaries depending on you can set your boundaries almost arbitrarily, depending on contingent historical factors. You can emphasize whichever ones you want to. So I would say, actually, really, for me, this is a world where it's the world formed by the political implementation of Abrahamic religion. And that's
what you would say is the hallmark of late antiquity, the political engagement of monotheism's political engagement with I don't want to say the wider Middle East, but definitely.
I mean, it was because it's beyond the Middle East. It's the inheritance of the urban political implementation of monotheism, including into cultures that are no longer urban. It's the places that have inherited those political norms. So in a sense, I'd say that's the a common strand for it's a political legacy that's inherited in that across that zone. But that includes all of all of Europe as well, and that's what Bullitt describes as an Islamo-Christian world.
What can the construction and maintenance of Christian churches in the early Islamic period tell us about the status and inner dynamic of Christian communities? One thing reading your book that I found very interesting is that it seems like what was going on in Christian communities doesn't mirror what I read in the Pact of Omar. And what I've come to find out about through archaeology, how Christian churches were maintained, and you don't see a whole lot of destruction, and that even Muslims at one point, you mentioned this in your book, used to use parts of Christian churches in order to engage in worship as well. So, yeah, what can the construction and maintenance of Christian churches in the early Islamic period tell us about the status and dynamics?
Thanks. Yes, so there's a nice edited volume by Simon Pierre and Maria Otrero that cover this issue. They compare the Mashriq and Spain as a very interesting volume, and that's mainly archaeology. So there are cases where Muslims very soon after the conquest seize major Christian churches in the middle of cities and turn them into mosques. And that is a major sign that government has changed, that Christian political power is subordinate. That happens in Damascus. But the famous scenes where the church is expropriated and the basilica is turned into the core of the Great Mosque. And if you go there now, it's still very recognizably based on a basilica. And there may be other examples of this happening, say, to fire temples in Iran. But the work of people like Matteo in Bologna has really emphasized that these are atypical, that most churches, in fact, most central churches, continue to operation and they continue to be repaired. So in spite of what the later Islamic law says, Christians are really allowed to repair and build churches, and that continues to be true into the, into the Ottoman period. There are places where that doesn't happen, but they tend to be exceptional. And the mass confiscation of churches doesn't happen really until the aftermath of the First Crusade. So that's when the major churches in Aleppo are converted into mosques. So a very different demographic context. So by and large, I would say Muslims tread fairly carefully in terms of the expropriation of churches. I think what we do see is a movement from a kind of tolerance by neglect and a tolerance by design. So I think in the 7th and 8th century, there really isn't much Muslim governmental presence, especially in the countryside. And there, I think people are allowed to get away with what they want. I think what changes in the 9th century is that the notional ban on church construction is used to destroy churches and monasteries when it's convenient and possible for Muslim governments to do so. So in scenarios like in Haran and Edessa that Dionysius describes, you have churches being destroyed. In one case, I think that the Muslim crowd identifies newly built or newly repaired churches for the government to destroy. And so you can see I think there's a pressure there. Maybe the initiative is not coming from the government, but it's coming from a Muslim crowd, a low crowd of local Muslims who want that church destroyed and maybe want the building materials or want the space or have a particular reason for an anti-Christian animus. So we shouldn't necessarily see this as something that's being imposed by Muslim governments, but it may come from grassroots Muslim agendas.
Yeah, that's one thing that I noticed in your book. You really didn't get too deep into it, but that from the top, it seems like the rulers or the Muslim rulers were more tolerant of the minority communities, whereas there might not have been that same sentiment amongst the populace.
Yeah, I mean, for Haran, it's hard to prove, but my instinct is that I think the Muslim crowd in Haran may be recently converted slaves. So I wonder if they are slave populations that have been owned by the church
Mm.
and become Muslims, and their freedom has been linked to their conversion. And so then you've got a population of local Muslims that really dislikes the church and is intent on using their newfound status to, attack church property. So I wonder if there's a particular reason for that animus there. And other examples, maybe I think you've got people coming from places further east where you have much larger Muslim populations, and you don't have you don't have a long-standing culture of sort of mutual understanding. They've recently come in, Khorasanis and Turks. So a number of the people who are rude to Dionysius or who are accused of mistreating Christians are Khorasanis.
And how did the increased centralization of sort of Muslim governance culminating in the Abbasids
Mm,
and the continued sort of geographic movement of centers of power during all these changes of power
mm,
create and alter regional hierarchies for the church?
yeah, yeah. I mean, I guess this might sound silly. One way I've thought about this is like when Americans sometimes talk, or Californians and people in New England talk about flyover states. When you've got places in the Midwest that don't matter anymore, and they've kind of been passed over by later trends in industrialization. And I guess that's how I think about certain places in the Christian geography of the Abbasid world. So places like Cyrrhus, which is it's near Afrin, it's in northern, far north of Syria. It had been a significant Roman city, but without its own sort of major hinterland, and it's not near any area where large numbers of without Muslim political authority. So to some extent, it's like allowed to get on with its own, get on as it's always done. But it's whenever it enters into a confrontation with people with a power base that's near Muslim authority, it loses out. And that's really one of the key stories of Dionysius's reign is his conflict between the Gubbite monks, who have a monastery that's supported by the elites, the aristocrats of Cyrus, and the fight between them and churchmen who are based in places like Raqqa and Tikrit. And the men of Cyrus and the Gubbites clearly don't think it's going to work out that way, but they lose. And one of the reasons is that the Rakkans are supported by the Abbasid government. And when push comes to shove, the Abbasids allow the patriarch to send in Persian troops and arrest all these monks who are being obstreperous, and they get thrown in prison. So I think Muslim political authority ultimately gives power to churchmen who are based in Muslim political centers. And in the long run, older places lose out. Not necessarily older, but they haven't benefited from later changes in politics and economics. Have I made sense? Do you want me to?
No, that makes
Yeah.
perfect sense.
Yeah. So I'd say that the one part of the story is how Raqqa becomes more significant than places like Cyrus. So you can have places that have produced patriarchs in the past, or with prestige that goes back deep into the Roman period, but that doesn't really count for anything if you face political opposition by someone who's well connected to contemporary Muslim leaders.
Which was the case for Dionysius, and the Gubites, from what I remember, had a larger following, so to speak. They were more popular, if I could describe them in that sense.
Well, we don't really know in terms of numbers how many people are following either party. But I mean, Dionysius doesn't push it too hard. So he makes it easy for people to get on. He
Mm.
says, look, you can have, I realize that Syrians have this liturgy. I'm not going to interfere with it. As patriarch, I endorse this liturgy, but I'm not going to burst into your church and tell you what to say, which is what his predecessor had done. He says, look, you will, laissez-faire. But the Gubbites are still kind of angry, and they still want one of their own number to be patriarch. And they kind of, at least that's how Dionysius presents it, they continue to up the ante. And then the result is there's never a Gubbite patriarch again.
And I like the analogy that Dionysius drew from when the caliph prays, no one in congregation says anything about what he chooses to pray. But I can't remember the word he used, but basically, like these ingrates, they make a huge fuss
Yeah.
because I'm not saying a certain liturgy. I thought that was a really good an analogy that he drew.
And he's doing that to appeal to al-Maʻmun and say, we're both leading prayer. So that's one strand of the Imam analogy. He's saying we're both prayer leaders. We wouldn't put up with disorder of that kind.
Right.
So and I guess, I mean, one of the features there is Maʻmun's own contest with people like Ahmad ibn Hanbal, who are not agreeing with him, not keeping in line. So it's about saying, we are both, we're both in charge. We need to support one another to make sure that internal dissidents within our religions keep in line.
So, how does manuscript production and art history offer a useful lens for tracking the changes that the new administrative and economic geography was eliciting?
Hmm. I mean, that's a great question. And I confess it's not really a question I answered properly in the book. What I would like to do, like stimulated actually by your question, it would be nice to map changing like sites of manuscript production over time. So you could see, what are the key centers of patronage, and how does patronage differ from patronage in Syriac and patronage in Arabic. So that would be something that would be nice to do. So I can't answer your question properly there. In terms of art history, there's a certain amount that comes out of Egypt. So Deir es-Surian produces a number of really nice inscriptions and poems written on the walls of the monastery, so one can use those. There's not a massive amount, and um, there's a coffin from Tikrit, I think it's 10th century, that's now in Athens. That's from a Jacobite bishop. So there's a small amount of material like that, but so art history wasn't a particular focus of that book, and maybe that's something I need to get into later. There's a lot of really good stuff on 13th century and sort of Mongol context, things from northern Iraq. Bas Sneldas's work is very interesting.
So you describe in your book how Christian interactions with the Caliphal government produce a distinctively Islamicate church
Mm.
under the Abbasids.
Yeah, yeah.
What does the term Islamicate mean here exactly, and why do you think it's a productive term for understanding this particular historical context?
Sure. So Marshall Hodgson in the 60s coins the term Islamicate to refer to the shared culture that's generated by all people under Muslim rule. So, and he gives the example of the manufacture of tiraz cloth, but a shared use of Arabic might be another one. Shared culture that's shared in use of Arabic. So he wants to say, look, there are people who are participating in this culture who are not Muslim. And so we suffer from using the word Islamic to describe what's going on. And he also coined the term Islamdom as an analogy to Christendom, which didn't
Is
really.
that right? I didn't know that.
Yeah, it didn't really catch on, so no one's really used that. I actually think there's some mileage to that, to maybe describe the Buyids and the Samanids and the Safarids as all belonging to a sort of Islamdom. They're all in the sense that you can say France, Germany, and Italy belong to a Christendom. They're united by a shared religion of the rulers and a former caliphal inheritance that they struggle over and redefine. So I didn't. That's not what I was doing in this book.
I mean, I do know that some people take issue with some of these words, Islamicate, Islamdom, Mohammedan. I actually find that, within a certain context, all of them actually can be useful.
It's horses for courses. It depends what you're doing. No term is going to satisfy every context. So if I use Islamicate, it's not because I think other people ought to use it in the same way that I use it, but it's a term that I'm going to define for my own purposes.
Yeah,
I
and
don't. Yeah.
I was reading H.A.R. Gibbs' book. I can't remember what book exactly. I was in the bookstore and I had some time, and I
Yeah.
came across his articulation or understanding of Muhammadan. I can't remember exactly how he explained it, but it definitely made sense in the sense that, hey, Muslims follow Muhammad, and call them Mohammedan is almost like saying Christian. And he the way he went about it kind of made sense, and that like opened my mind to like, within certain contexts you kind of can make these things work without them being offensive.
Sure. I mean, a Mohammedan has, because it has this history of being used in missionary polemic,
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
more touchy. But yeah, I've not read Gibbs' defense of it, so I should read that.
Yeah, it was
Uh,
in the introduction of one of his books. I can't remember the name of his book off the top of my head. I do have it at my father's house, but yeah, I'm probably gonna have to revisit it.
Interesting. Um, so Shahab Ahmed criticizes Hodgson for using Islamicate, and he says it implies that there's a neat division between culture and religion. And I think his animus is he's so against it because he says that kind of gives that help. The only people that helps is Salafis who who want to imagine this absolute division between culture and religion. Um, but I think also, I'd also say we should remember where. So Shahab Ahmed's book also takes him to places where I wouldn't want to go, where he ends up saying that Sikhs are Islamic or that Maimonides is Islamic, and that, to my mind, is a mischaracterization. And he ends up doing that because he doesn't have a word like Islamicate.
Mm.
Um, I think I was speaking to Shazza Bashir about this because he was reticent about Islamicate as well. And I think it's okay as long as one has equivalent terms like Christianate to go with it. So I was looking at a study comparing the clash of cultures between Jews from Barcelona and Jews from Valencia, who had Jews from Valencia had a kind of Muslim style way of doing things in terms of social behavior, like marrying multiple wives, I think. And the ones from Barcelona didn't. They had a more Frankish Christian way of doing things. And I described that clash. They're all Jews, but I described it as a clash between a Christianate Jewish population and an Islamicate one. Um,
Makes sense.
so that's how I do that. People do borrow cultural features from one another, but they're not going to adhere to a different religion. And I think that one needs to do justice to that.
And so you note that Dionysius's dependency upon and defense of the authority of al-Maʻmun in order to legitimize his own leadership results in him closing off any conceptual space for a Christian martial identity.
Yeah.
Um, the kind once held by Christian Arabs and still pursued by some highland Christian populations. What were the long-term consequences of this in terms of limiting the political agency of Christian populations living under Muslim rule and eliminating their ability to resist the government?
Well, I think revolt in this context is a form of political negotiation. So if you're armed and have military experience, you can contest the claims of government. And more or less, outside highland areas, the only ways a peasantry can revolt is if you've got an elite who are willing to back them up.
Mm.
So Dionysius is really endorsing the status quo that's occurred in the 7th century, where at least in the Levant, post-Roman populations have been under Sasanian rule for 30 years, a whole generation. So you've already lost a generation of military experience. And then when the Muslims show up, they sort of keep that running. So there's no way of people have lost that experience of serving in armies.
Mm.
And that's crucial because it allows you to contest what the state does. You can have an armed rebellion and say, no, we'll pay tax at this rate, not this rate. And many negotiations between the state and elites about how much tax is going to get paid stops long, long before there's a rebellion. But here the state is dealing with populations that really cannot rebel unless they have some kind of outside support and cannot rebel effectively. So
that kind of bargaining chip was removed from them because of
the elites and the peasantry. They've lost that bargaining chip for the most part. This is in the Levant. It's slightly different in Iraq.
And I never really saw revolt or rebellion as a way of negotiating politics with the government or the way of negotiating with government until engaging with Hannah-Lena's Hagman's book or work. And yeah, it just blew my mind that that's the way of kind of imposing your terms in pre-industrial societies. And I've always saw rebellion and revolt as just wanton destruction and killing, but she really added some kind of sophistication to it in the way that she describes it.
There probably can be moments of just sheer desperation of populations that have been driven right against the wall and have lost everything. But I think most revolts should probably be seen as some kind of invitation to negotiate. And you're telling the state, look, we can cause enough trouble that it's worth your while doing a deal with us.
Okay.
And because we live in much more governed contexts, we kind of forget that.
I know we have a bit of historical amnesia in that sense.
Yeah, exactly. So I mean, it's much hard. If I just want to declare I'm not going to pay my taxes, I don't have the kind of experience to contest the government. I don't have the network to do that. So I'm just going to get put in prison. And everyone's going to go, Philip, you're stupid. You should have just paid your taxes. But if we have, if I have the kind of experience of warfare and the social network to contest government, and if government's monopoly of violence is as relatively weak as it is in pre-industrial states, then there's sort of moment of contestation.
Mm.
So Dionysius is like thrown away the steering wheel on this stuff. He says, look, we're just going to support the government and do what the government says, and the government's going to be fair to us. And there are contexts where people won't agree with him, where people feel they have a means of opposing what if the government's going to behave in an authoritarian way. So that's sort of what's happening in the Bashmarite rebellions in Egypt, and that's kind of like what's happening for the Mahdeites in Lebanon. And then you've also got populations who might want to support the Byzantines, who are hopeful for a Byzantine reconquest, which of course is what ultimately happens in Syria. Uh, so you've got this guy shows up called Shamta in Edessa, and Dionysius is really embarrassed about him. And I suspect he's actually a Jacobite. I think Dionysius would probably tell us if he was a Melkite. So Dionysius doesn't want this to become typical and doesn't want to endorse this kind of behavior. And one reason for that is Dionysius relies on Abbasid authority for his own authority. And he is the beneficiary of a kind of borrowed authoritarianism that will lend him troops when he wants to lock up a troublemaker or when he wants to raise tithes.
Yeah, I would have hated to go against Dionysius in that time because he had the ear of the Caliphate, and anytime he ran into any kind of trouble, he could just go over to not any official, but to a certain official and pull strings.
Yeah. I mean, specifically, he's I think embedded in a Tahirid patronage network. So he's a major client of Abdullah ibn Tahir, who's the governor of in Raqqa. Abdullah controls a super governorate that combines both Egypt and Syria, which hasn't happened in the last century. And it's through Abdullah that he has the caliph's ear.
Mm.
One of the most fascinating aspects of your book that you've just touched upon a little bit is the sort of the changing status of the Christian aristocracy in particular, and how the fall of the Roman and Sasanian empires affected that status. What were the key ways in which they adapted to maintain their status under Muslim rule?
Mm. Well, I think one adaptation is going into the church. So someone like Dionysius is, even though he's often saying, I've been depicting him as, undermining the ability of a martial aristocracy to contest government, but he's probably of that kind of background himself. So an element there is sort of intra-elite competition. And I think one of the ways that Dionysius tells his own interactions with politics and contrasts it to those of his predecessors, he's saying, I've got the nous to know how to operate in a court. I'm not going to wind up the caliph. I'm not going to get in trouble. I'm going to be a successful political operator who can agitate for our collective interest. So I think I would see Dionysius himself as sort of from an aristocratic background, and he's very proud of it. He talks about his personal family history of the Rusaffaye and the Gumaye, people who've done well under Abd al-Malik, or people who were court or major aristocrats in the end of the Roman Empire. So he can go back several generations and tell us that history. And it's unusual because we don't normally get these kinds of aristocratic family histories. It's the kind of stuff where it's the church or states tend to have these more successful long-term memories. Aristocrats try, but they can't do it on that kind of scale. So he's unusual in that he can promote his own family in that way. So I'd say that those familial histories, that's probably going to be more typical of how most aristocrats behave. And what Dionysius does, Dionysius' history is so interesting because it preserves these aristocratic memories.
I mean, because aristocratic memories of individuals were hardly preserved, is Dionysius's telling met with any kind of suspicion? Like, because there were so few, the fact that he comes with such an elaborate one, is there any way like, oh no, this can't be. This is just
Well,
too much of an
there's
anomaly.
no pushback against that. I would see what he's describing, these landed aristocrats who also periodically work for the caliphate as bureaucrats or administrators and often make lots of money doing that. I think that's probably more typical.
Mm.
And some of them, won't be making loads of money. They'll just be on their estates and running things much as they did in the Roman Empire. So I think for these aristocrats from Cyrus who were supporting the Gubites, I think there's this atrophy of power that they maybe haven't quite noticed. But other than that, I think life is pretty similar to what it's been like under the Romans. Maybe with the exception that in conditions where the state is weak, aristocrats can probably charge more tax. So um, to some extent, the state is going to protect peasants because it's interested in long-term prosperity. I mean, aristocrats don't always have those incentives and might be more inclined to just milk them.
Mm.
So there's a scene from the Chronicle of John of Nicu where these aristocrats have been also working as tax collectors for the Roman state. The Roman state collapses, and then the aristocrats take the opportunity to double or quadruple the taxes paid by peasants. Except now, none of this money is going to the state. Aristocrats just keeping it for themselves.
Did Dionysius's aristocratic status make him a particularly attractive or appropriate candidate in the eyes of his co-religionists?
I think, yes, I think it did. He can't say so directly. So there's an embarrassment about wealth or about improper election. So I think he does this. He advertises his skills. They're the kind of skills that aristocrats have. But he doesn't, I think, I'm not sure that there's no sense for the description of his election which overtly advertises his background, but I think people are conscious of that. There's another account of the election of a major patriarch from the beginning of the 7th century, and he's called Athanasius Gamaliel, um, Athanasius the camel driver. And the story goes that he's elected when he is mucking out the camels. And when they elect him patriarch, he says, no, I've got to finish my job. I've got to dispose of all this camel poo. And it's meant to show that he's, just a normal monk. But it omits to mention that he's from an aristocratic family from Samosata, and his brother is also a bishop. And those stories don't get put into this description of how lowly and humble he is. He's just, the most lowly and humble monk. And it doesn't mention all these relatives he has who are very important.
To what extent did I kept calling him Dionysius, but it's Dionysius.
Yeah.
If you can just educate me for a second, so I don't continue butchering his name.
Oh, it doesn't. Dionysius.
Dionysius. Okay, so to what extent did Dionysius' political strategies reflect a broader pattern among non-Muslim religious leaders under Abbasid rule? Was this approach unique to just Jacobite Christianity, or do we see similar developments in the Greek Orthodox, Armenian, or Nestorian traditions? And how
Mm.
did the political prominence of a specific patriarchs impact the confessional diversity among Christians under Muslim rule?
Thanks. Great question. I can't answer it very well. I'm trying to. Um, so this is the kind of thing I'm trying to do with my current project on group formation under the Abbasids to really contrast the patterns for different communities. Um, it's hard to work out exactly how typical Dionysius is because he's the only person who gives us a narrative that's so rich. I have an article in Press where I use the bishoprics and compare them to the monasteries. So I see which monasteries elect bishops where, to track different modes of centralization in the Jacobite Church. So I propose that in a circa about 870, you stop getting patriarchs being elected from Raqqa and they start being elected from places in the Torabdin, which is probably the big population centers for the Jacobites. So I think that's a moment of kind of the retreat of the state from the church, where this kind of ability of patriarchs to command political power disappears. And then I think there's a sort of abortive moment when that almost there's a sort of transfer to northern Syria, and I think that's to do with the Hamdanids, the post-Abbasid dynasty, sub-Abbasid dynasty. And then there's a second transfer to Melitene, which is then under Byzantine rule. So there's these moments where political connections become more important or intensified, and there's moments when they abate. That's one part of your answer. In terms of comparing different confessions, I think the Church of the East, the Nestorians, they're the big beneficiaries of the Abbasid revolution. They are the sort of Church of the Sasanian Empire.
They were
They
responsible largely for the translation movement as well, or was it more a collective of Christians?
well, I certainly the most famous translators are from the Church of the East. But it's hard to. I think all Christian confessions are engaged in that to some extent. So Hanani ibn Ishaq, who's the big name in the translation movement, he is a member of the Church of the East. And then the Catholicos Timothy commissions a number of high-profile translations. But there's a number of names that Ibn al-Nadin gives us in the Fihrist of translators who aren't identified by sect,
Mm,
and not always possible to tell from the names. Um, yeah, so the Nestorians, I think, are the big beneficiaries. So if places like Raqqa benefit from movements in population and political power, that's even more true for Baghdad and Mosul. And the Nestorian political language is exceptionally sycophantic.
mm.
So there's lots and lots of um, praise of the Caliph as the only possible ruler of the universe, that kind of thing. And Jean-Maurice Fillet describes the Nestorians as the second established religion of the Caliphate.
Mm.
They command the final court of appeal for Christians, which gives the Nestorian Patriarch the ability to intervene in how any Christian confession is governing itself. And those are abilities that are given to it by the Abbasids in the 10th century. The Melkites probably suffer the most under Islamic rule, at least initially. There's, I think, quite a lot of Bedouin settlement of the Transjordan, a lot of places that had been, a lot of people who'd lived in settlements go over to becoming nomads. So you see these disappearance of these bishoprics in the Transjordan. The Levant is relatively disempowered, southern Levant, so loss of trading connections. The Melkites had been the official church under the Romans, so they lose that support. And then they also suffer this schism between so-called Maximite and Maronite Chalcedonians. Um, so they divide in two. But to a great extent, they begin to bounce back in the 9th century. I think there's a controversy among the Melkites you see where there's quite a lot of criticism of bishops that is much more apparent for the Melkites than for other groups. So many of the texts that Christian Sana has looked at, they're composed in Melkite Palestinian contexts, where monasteries and ascetics criticize the bishops for refusing to, for being too wedded to the Islamic State
Mm.
and for refusing to assist the conversion of Muslims. So that's seen as sort of they're seen as sellouts, and that kind of internal criticism, you don't really get that for Nestorians and Jacobites, and I think that's more than just an issue of source survival. And then finally, the groups that really suffer are groups who call themselves Christians, but who are not recognized as Christians by the other churches or by the Abbasids.
Like Manichaeans.
Manichaeans and Marcionites, yeah. So they are sometimes described as Thanoian, as dualists. The Manichees in particular are heavily persecuted under the early Abbasids. But they would call themselves Christians. And in a sense, the fact that modern secondary literature tends not to call them Christians is a sign of how much modern scholars have internalized the ideas of the Muslim heresiologists and the Orthodox Christian heresiologists.
How do the historical narratives that Dionysius preserves in his Chronicle
Yeah.
reveal evolving attitudes towards the political proximity of Christian leaders with Muslim rulers and
Mm.
their reliance on caliphal support?
Yeah. Yeah. So he preserves a narrative from. So Dionysius is a graduate of the monastery of Keneshre, which is a major site for the teaching of a kind of curriculum based on Greek philosophy. It's Hellenizing, I guess. So it's in Syriac, but it's using lots of Greek ideas. And the monastery of Keneshre had historically been a rival to another monastery called Khatmin, which still exists. It's the monastery of Mar Gabriel in near to Midyat in the Torabdin. And a number of patriarchs were elected from Khatmin in the turn of the 750s, the turn of the Abbasid revolution. Most famous of them is a man called Athanasius Sandalaya. Um, and Dionysius preserves this Khatminite criticism of Athanasius, in particular his proximity to the new Abbasid regime. So Athanasius is, first of all, gets the patronage of Marwan II as the last Umayyad Caliph, and then he really cozies up to al-Mansur. And he gets a lot of benefits through that relationship. He's really able to defy the standing patriarch when the patriarch tries to criticize him. So he's only a bishop. He's only a bishop, and he has this really good these court connections. And when the patriarch tries to summon him to a synod to be punished, he says, "No, not coming." And he can just defy what the patriarch wants because he's got these really good court connections. And he uses this to elevate his own bishopric into a metropolitanate. So he changes the status of his bishopric. He founds these major monasteries nearby, which have a long legacy. They continue to operate into the 10th century. And he does all this because he's got these strong connections. And he's the major villain, really, of the very early Abbasid section of Dionysius's Chronicle. So in that era, there's big criticism of people who use court connections in this way, but it's become normal by Dionysius's era. And he never openly admits that he's doing the kinds of things that this hated predecessor has done. It's good for him to do it, but it's bad for Athanasius to do it. And one reason for that is that Athanasius is from Khatmin, the wrong monastery. And another reason is that he's drawing on an earlier source tradition. Where I think Christian attitudes to engagement with the caliphate have really changed over those two generations.
So, what were the limitations on the ability of patriarchs to intercede on behalf of themselves and their communities? And how do they expose the vulnerability of both the patriarchal office and Christian populations under Muslim rule?
Mm. So we see that, I mean, the biggest fluctuation is that the Abbasids themselves face a number of revolts. So during the third Fitna, there's this collapse in the ability of a patriarch to command. There's a collapse in the ability of well-connected men to flourish. So we see this for Athanasius, actually, that after Marwan II is deposed, there's a period he has to do what the patriarch tells him.
Mm.
And then when the Abbasids kind of come in properly and Athanasius gets in with them, then he can defy the patriarch again. Similarly, for Kyriakos, who's Dionysius's predecessor, I think one reason he has all this trouble with the Gubites is there's no Abbasid government in Syria who can back him up. So I think that's the major answer, is that that strategy of being close to political authority to maintain your power. We're still dealing with a pre-industrial state that faces major rebellion, and there are moments when the caliph's writ is not going to work. There are also scenarios, I think, which are more local or regional, where the caliph is reliant for his own government, or the governor is reliant for his own government on nomadic forces who are difficult to control, where members of Bedouin clans have been able to extort advantages from the government and claim and set themselves up in government themselves. And then if they mistreat local Christians or local Muslims for that matter, the government doesn't really have a free hand to tell them to be obedient and has to just put up with it. So you see that for the Banu Iyad in Palestine, southern Syria, in Dionysius's time. So yeah, there are all these holes in Abbasid authority, and I think episcopal authority and sometimes suffers in those holes as well.
So all these holes while they were becoming more centralized.
Yes, so I'd say yes, the Abbasids are extremely centralized compared to many pre-industrial states, but they still have all sorts of blind spots, all sorts of holes in the net.
Would you say that they were more centralized than, say, the Umayyad governmental structure? Because one thing that I used to say a while ago was that the Umayyads were the only Muslim empire that had centralized government. After them, it all just fell to pieces. But after reading your book, you mention that, or you say, or you demonstrate that the Abbasids were consolidating power, centralizing power. Um, but yeah, so that just kind of threw me for a loop. Like, were the Abbasids centralized? Were the Umayyads more central, have more centralized power, or did then you say the Abbasids had a lot for a pre-industrial society? So I'm just a bit confused.
I would say that there is a long-term trend towards centralization that runs at least from Abdul Malik into the first Abbasid century.
Okay,
Um,
so you can't just cut it with the knife. This empire was more centralized, but it was actually a running theme that they both kind of.
so I think there's an inclination to. So I think under the Sufyanids, there's a much more sort of laissez-faire attitude, but that's partly because they have other sources of wealth from the expanding empire. They're taking booty from lots of different places. But I think, under the Marwanids, they're not able to. The Futuh is kind of slowing down, and they need to make sure they're getting money from land. So it's starting to look more and more like a traditional Near Eastern empire. And they're getting the money from the land tax and poll taxes. And I think census and taxation is more intensified under al-Mansur, and there's a lot of complaint about that. But it comes with initiatives like having an army that's paid in coin, not in kind. Um, but when I say more or less centralized, it's still, we're still dealing with pre-industrial states, and we're dealing with governmental change that's affected by revolution. So those are all sort of caveats when I use a word like centralized.
And in what way did the assertion of strong social boundaries against sort of non-Christian and non-Jacobite outsiders enable patriarchs like Dionysius to maintain their authority over their community?
Yeah.
And how did these assertions of these boundaries sort of manifest, particularly in the policing of female behavior in this sort of community?
So the canon law is really useful for this. You can trace a number of these initiatives through canon law. And you get instructions to women to veil and then to double veil. Exactly what's meant by this is not clear. But I would see this as a response to an environment where there are wealthy, prestigious, non-Christian men are attractive, romantic possibilities and economic possibilities for the fathers of these women. So it's a double function. It's saying fathers cannot marry their daughters to Muslims, and also saying that daughters cannot marry Muslims. So there's both of those are intentions there. So one is sort of trying to limit romantic chance or romantic possibility, but the other is trying to delimit political alliances that lie outside the community. And for me, the question is, why should Christian heads of households put up with the limitations on their own power that these laws imply? Because they're saying you can't just betroth your daughter to whoever you like. You have to do so in a church. And you have to make sure that the girl agrees to it. You can't just do whatever you want. So why would a father, a powerful aristocrat, why would a powerful man put up with these limitations? And I think it's because that there's a collective fear of Muslim encroachment. That if people don't stick together, a given community, if too many people in a given community marry out, they'll lose that enough land that they won't be able to maintain collective institutions. So those kinds of the patriarch's acquisition of those kinds of powers are accepted by heads of households because they don't want that to happen. And crucially, it's an environment where women can inherit property. So people are not indifferent to who a girl marries because that will give a property claim to the husband. And it will allow the husband to then have part of an estate and to settle his own allies on that estate. And that husband's political interests may not align with those of the wider community. I mean, this is exactly why people want to marry within families. People marry their cousins to prevent that kind of thing happening. And that level of the distrust about the outsider is going to be even more true where you have people coming in as migrants from outside with a lot of money, with different kinds of connections, which can't be readily employed by locals. So there's scenes in not for Christians, but there's scenes in the aftermath of Babak's revolt in Azerbaijan, where Muslim elites marry they marry the daughters of non-Muslim lords as a way of expropriating their land.
Mm.
So land expropriation is linked to marriage.
And obviously, this is exacerbated by the Quranic prescription about the ability of Muslim men to marry Christian women and its prohibition of the reverse.
Yes, exactly. So in scenarios where, if you have a scenario where locally a Christian man has prestige and money, he's still not going to be able to marry Muslim women. And I think probably in the immediate aftermath of the conquest, Muslim men can marry many Christian women and take all of their land.
What can Dionysius's account of the civil war between al-Mamun and al-Maʻmun, known as the Fourth Fitna, tell us about his own relationship with the Caliph and the Muslim elite? How does his perspective differ from that of Muslim historians like al-Tabari?
So Tabari and Yaqubi have often offer a number of different narratives about the Fourth Fitna. But what I would stress in general is just that Dionysius looks very much like them. So in a sense, Dionysius is writing just after the Fourth Fitna. So it shows that, at least for this case, Tabari and Yaqubi are accessing sources that the narratives, the discourses that they're using around the Fourth Fitna have already coalesced very quickly after the events themselves, some of them. Dionysius also gives unsurprisingly, he gives a bigger role to al-Maʻmun's general Tahir, who's the father of his own patron. I think that's the big takeaway for me from his account of the Fourth Fitna is pro-Tahirid account. And it's a nice illustration of how we shouldn't just see it as a Christian reception of what's going on the Fourth Fitna. This is a Tahirid one. He's a Christian who's embedded in a Tahirid patronage network, and I see him primarily through that lens.
And how does his presence as a character in his own narrative of the events of the Civil War enable his own sort of self-fashioning as an Orthodox patriarch? And are there any notable silences or suppressions of information in the depiction of his own actions or those of al-Maʻmun that are particularly self-serving?
That's a great question. I probably need to think about that more. I mean, there's a lot of his self-fashioning as a historian. So he wants to so the war between Amin and al-Maʻmun in Syria is really an occasion for local warlords to seize power. So you don't see they are Aminid only in name, really. They're just out for themselves. And there's a warlord called Nasr bin Shabath who takes over Edessa. And he besieges Edessa, and there's a negotiated truce between Nasr bin Shabath and Abdullah ibn Tahir. And Dionysius claims to watch Nasr bin Shabath leave with all his wives and his goods and his retainers, and he basically numbers them, enumerates who they are and how they leave the city. And I think that's meant to it's not invented. I think it's all he wants to use that kind of information, that kind of his own personal eyewitness wherever he can. And I think it's a way of lending authority to his own work as a historian. He's a sort of witness to his own times. Are there areas where he suppresses events? I think once, when I first looked at the source, I thought that we could track Muslim-Christian relations by kind of looking at the dates and locations of occasions of the mistreatment of Christians. That was my first approach. And I tried to make this kind of timeline or interactive map where you could see where these events happened. But then it occurred to me that actually what was happening is I think he was suppressing events that happened under Maʻmun to give the impression that before Maʻmun and after Maʻmun, things were really rubbish for Christians. But I think his propensity to mention events or to date events is determined by that agenda. Mm. So we can't just do what my instinct was. You cannot just go through it and try to find patterns like that because the data's been pre-cooked by Dionysius. He's had the same agenda. He's already thinks that people will read his text in that way, and he's put this cluster of offences here and a cluster of offences here, and says, "Look, this is how great Maʻmun was." But I think that's manipulated. He's there to endorse his own special relationship with his patron, his special patron. In contrast to his relationship to Maʻmun, he really doesn't get along with Maʻmun's brother, Abu Ishaq, who later becomes the Caliph al-Mu'tasim. And Dionysius gives the impression that Mu'tasim was a sort of homicidal maniac and really intensely dislikes him. And then Mu'tasim becomes Caliph. And I think that's really bad for Dionysius, really unfortunate. That this man he's had all these public rows with has then become Caliph. So Dionysius is really screwed. And at that moment, so when Mu'tasim asks him to come and visit him, Dionysius insists that he give him an aman. He give him a specific promise that he won't kill him. So I think Dionysius is really on the back foot. He's heavily critical as well when Mu'tasim found Samarra. And he says he's only chosen this place because he likes the hunting. And it's a stupid place to put a city. That opinion is probably endorsed by subsequent events.
And back to al-Maʻmun, focusing more on the title of your book. Yeah. How did Dionysius's adaptation of Muslim political discourse in his interactions with al-Maʻmun, particularly his appeal to the discourse of Dhimma, and his reimagining of the patriarch as an imamate, enable him to effectively advocate for his community and maintain his authority over them?
Yeah, it's not just, yes, it's as much about his own personal authority in practice as it is about the flourishing of Christians in general. So the background to Dionysius's encounter with Maʻmun, there's sort of two features of the context. One is that there's a priest in Baghdad called Lazarus who has been deposed. There's a number of complaints against him by his congregation. And Dionysius's initial response is to ignore them or to let it be dealt with locally. And that hasn't worked. And they keep on appealing. This is starting to be a shameful issue for the church, is that this man who's been accused of unnamed crimes, probably sexual crimes, not named, it's sort of a matter. So he's been forced to intervene, and he tries to strip Lazarus of his church, strips him, he expels him from the church. And Lazarus has complained, and he has his own supporters. So that forces Dionysius to go to the Caliph. So that's one part of the context. The other part of the context is there's recently been an internal debate among the Jews where one group of Jews has, essentially wants to be governed differently. And I won't go into the details here, but one group is said by Dionysius to want to move the Sabbath. This is probably not true, but there are different matters of religious opinion among two Jewish groups. And on the one hand, Dionysius wants to have his own authority endorsed so he can remove this dissident priest. But on the other hand, he wants to make sure that the Jewish precedent isn't going to be applied to the Christians as well.
Mm. Where
So,
they, for each 10 in congregation, they're able to have a leader.
yeah, so that's what Mamun says. He says, that's what I've decided already for the Jews is that when you guys disagree, you can just have your own Dhimma. So you only have to have 10 people, then you can have 10 Jews and they can be a new Jewish communities. You can have multiple Jewish communities, multiple Christian communities, and they'll be okay. And then you
Dionysius was not having that.
no. So I mean, Mamun's model is you guys can just sort it out for yourself. And Dionysius says, no, you can't do that. Because firstly, as caliph, your predecessors have sworn to uphold the Christian religion. And part of that is that we should have a patriarch. So you can't undermine my authority. So you're essentially bound by what Umar and Uthman swore. So he's using Islamic history to bind Mamun and says, this is not the political authority among Christians is not a contingent thing. It can't just be changed in that way. It's as intrinsic that we should have a patriarch is an intrinsic part of Christianity. So yeah, you can't go around dividing up units of authority in that way. And he says also, you can't treat us like you treat Jews and Zoroastrians. You can't just treat us all as dhimmi. And Mamun goes, why not? That seems perfectly reasonable. And he says, this is where the contrast comes in. So he says, what they have is their leaders, and he calls them malke. And it's a word that can sometimes mean king or governor, but I think it just means we might translate heads of community. He says they have their authority from inheritance. So the exilarchs of the Jews have Davidic lineage, for instance. They have inheritance. It's like something that's inherited by blood. Whereas me and you, we're imams. And we're elected by the people, guided by God. So there's this contrast between Jews and Zoroastrians on the one hand and Muslims and Christians on the other, as populations that are either governed by inheritance or by divine sanction. And they're also using the language of kingship as something that's negative. And that's something I think that Dionysius draws from Abbasid critique of the Umayyads. So the Abbasids would say that the Umayyads are mere kings. They're not caliphs. They're not appointed by God. His use of the word Imam is a specifically Abbasid ring to it, because it emphasizes someone who leads the community in prayer. But it also has a history of use since the Abbasid revolution. So the Abbasid revolutionaries had used the term Imam. That's true of the Zaydis as well, or other Shi'i opponents of the Umayyads, to use the term Imam to mean the person who ought to be caliph. So the person who, and it is in that sense that the Abbasids refer to their ruler as Imam. So it's both Imam and caliph. So this is a moment where God's intentions for the world have actually been actioned. And these are very live issues as well, because al-Maʻmun issues coins in his own name as Imam al-Huda during the fourth Fitna. So Dionysius is essentially adapting and reusing Maʻmun's own political language back to him in order to present himself as a fellow Imam and therefore shore up his own authority. Mm. So there's lots of different layers to this speech. Of course, it's Dionysius' speech to Maʻmun. We don't know what he really said, but this is what he wants to be thought to be saying this. And it's part of his display of how well he knows a Muslim context. So he's showing a Christian audience how well he knows that context. There are a couple of catches, though, which is that He emphasizes the fact that as an imam, he's been elected and that God's choice is shown through election. Whereas Ma'mun's actually come to power not through shura, he's not come to power through election, but through revolution, essentially. He's overthrown Amin by force of arms. And as Patricia Crona says, there's a kind of Zaidi strand to Ma'mun that says the imam is going to be selected through victory on the battlefield rather than just by descent. So I think there's an element, those are features where either Dionysius doesn't know how Mamun has presented himself to his own constituencies, or he's, I think, and this is probably more likely, he's just conveniently ignored it.
I mean, obviously, as you explained, sort of he draws a parallel between his own imamate and the al-Maʻmun by emphasizing election as
Yep.
a defining feature of the imamate.
Yep.
And you just explained also how that's complicated by sort of concepts of revolution and the Abbasidian revolution. But also, isn't it complicated by sort of the way that the term imam was used, which is associated with actually legitimacy that was based on pious lineage, that was based on inheritance.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so, and particularly obviously in Shia communities.
Mm.
So was Dionysius aware of that wider context, the fact that it was based actually on inheritance, and the fact that even al-Maʻmun utilizes the term during the fourth fitna in a way that implies pious lineage as well?
I'm not sure that Dionysius. So, in terms of the way that al-Maʻmun uses this in political addresses, I'd see, and this is where I absolutely follow Crona, I'd see him more in terms of the Zaidi mold than the 12 Shi'i mold. So I think it's more, what he emphasizes is less about his personal family, other than just being a member of the Quraysh, is less about his family than it is about his, the fact that he's the one brave enough to stand up for the oppressed. So I think that's the kind of language that he uses in his letter to the army. Yes, there is the 12 Shi'i model is more in terms of dissent. It would emphasize dissent much more. And I think earlier, because earlier versions of the Abbasid claim have emphasized nas much more of a personal selection. So those are sorry, I've got a bit of sun. Those are versions of the imamic rhetoric that I think aren't touched here in particular. So yes, I think it's simply politically inconvenient for Dionysius to emphasize dissent as a feature. For him, dissent is a feature that defines kingship. And because he wants to describe Jews and Zoroastrians as kingly in a bad way, then he doesn't want to do that. So there's lots of features of the description that are about Dionysius' own rhetoric.
You mentioned in your book that al-Maʻmun was essentially an outlier in Abbasid politics. He was a very unusual character in the wider scheme of Abbasid history, suggesting that, yeah, he was unusual in the broader history of Abbasid rule. Do you think the leverage Dionysius was able to wield with al-Maʻmun could have been possible with any other caliph before or after his reign, or did Dionysius find himself in a unique historical situation? You kind of alluded to that by talking about al-Maʻmun's brother who came to power after him and how things started to kind of fall apart in terms of the relationship that the patriarch had with the caliphate.
It's hard to be too precise because we have much more information about the relationship between a patriarch and a caliph for Mamun and Mu'tasim than we do for anyone else. So it's hard to make a kind of like for like comparison. There are caliphs who seem to have close relationships with various Nestorian patriarchs in the 10th century. But it's hard, we don't really have I haven't yet got enough of a sense of what they might reveal about their personal relations or their personalities. So I find that a hard question to answer. My suspicion is that Mamun has these specific agendas that Mamun has about order and about the role of religion in guaranteeing social order, I think that might be key to understanding at least how Dionysius presents his political rhetoric, and maybe also in explaining his success. That I think, well, at least as Dionysius writes it, Maʻmun is suspicious of religious and social disorder and wants to stop that. And then maybe that's part of a kind of Sasanian legacy that Maʻmun is inhabiting.
Mm.
So just to sum up, you know, your book obviously complicates some preconceived notions about the relationship between Muslims and Christians in this particular era. Some academics have represented the authority granted to clerical leaders under Muslim rule as a sign of sort of unique religious tolerance, particularly in the Abbasid and Ottoman periods. Do you agree with this characterization? And to what extent, in your view in particular, just to weave into this, have Quranic presumptions about Christians and Jews affected how Muslim leaders have historically governed religious communities with or without tolerance?
So I would say, if I start with the Quran, the fact that the Quran speaks in sometimes positive terms about Jews and Christians and conceives of Jews and Christians as distinct populations, that it parses humanity by religion. I think these are all starting points for later Muslim political ideas. At the same time, the Quran is no blueprint for those relations, and those have to be worked out through the evolution of the Sharia. So it's not simply the Quran is just a starting point for a lot of these discourses, or one starting point among many. The fact that, say, Hindus, Buddhists, Zoroastrians are not so clearly mentioned, Manichees, means that they have to insert themselves into a Muslim political imaginary. They have to either succeed or fail, but they have to make an active effort to agitate for their presence, whereas Jews and Christians are there automatically. With some caveats that there's this heavy polemic against the Trinity in the Quran, this polemic against Jews' notion of themselves as a chosen people. So there's caveats, and Jews and Christians are clearly hierarchically meant to be subordinate to Muslims, but they are they have this sort of pre-established. There's a prestige of a kind that they can draw upon from their access to a saintly culture that's attractive to many Muslims. But is it tolerance? Well, I think I'd beware of using a word like tolerance because it's so much a product of the 17th century. So if we use that word for earlier periods, we have to be aware that we're engaging in a retrojection, which doesn't mean we can never use it, but we have to be wary of it for that sense. I think what we have for Dionysius, we shouldn't confuse Dionysius's own positionality with that of Christians in general. He wants to make himself a leader for and a representative of the wider community. But he obviously doesn't represent people who want a Byzantine reconquest, or people who want someone else to be patriarch, or want to follow a different liturgy, or want to secede in some way. So we can recognize that he has a certain success in his own lifetime and that his works continue to be read. So that gives them another kind of success, posthumous success. But we shouldn't confuse that with thinking that he's representative of everyone. And rather like the Ottoman so-called millet system, lots of the people who complain about the abolition of the Ottoman millet in the 1920s or the 1850s, people during the Tanzimat, people complain about the equality of rights for Muslims and Christians. You get Christian clerics who make those complaints, Christian clerics who complain about secularism. But one reason they lose so much is because they are acknowledged by the state as the leaders of their communities. So, of course, they don't want that leadership to pass to secular elites of different kinds. whether these are landholders, as they are in across this period, or merchants or financiers or the different kinds of Christian elites who emerged in the Ottoman period. So we have to recognize that when you get Christian clerics who say what a great system this is, that they are its beneficiaries, they're its leaders, and that they are given a kind of borrowed authoritarianism by these imperial states that allow them to coerce and extract resources from their co-religionists. They legitimize this extraction. They say, this allows me to protect your rights against enemies. This allows me to reduce your taxation. But we shouldn't forget that it is an extraction.
Mm. All right. On that note, your book was phenomenal. It was actually the first one where I had a chance to really see the inner workings of what was going on in a community outside of what Muslims were doing. We always talk about Christians living under the Caliphate, but I think a lot of people, especially from a Muslim background or who read a lot of Islamic history, don't really know the inner workings or how these people got on with the new Muslim rule or even with the local populace. And your book, in terms of how it demonstrated how the patriarch collaborated or engaged with Islamic ideas and Muslim rule. Yeah, just really opened my eyes to something that I had no knowledge about, and I believe a lot more people would be interested in knowing. So I definitely recommend your book to our audience. It made me want to check out your work on the Chronicles of Surt. Even though I know it predated this book, I'm going to have to just backpedal a bit. So yeah, what else do you have coming up? Are you working on anything? Should we expect some kind of release coming out soon?
Well, so I have a English translation and historical commentary on the last part of the Chronicle of Sirt. So that's 580 to 660. So I realize that's a bit early for the viewers of your listeners of your podcast, but it's it's trying to make accessible this Christian Arabic text. There's some interesting material in it about Muhammad's alleged letters to the Christians. I
Mm.
think I would read these as interesting 10th century inventions of what Christians wanted Muhammad to have said. So a sort of Christian invention of Muhammad. But it also has lots of material that I think is pretty close, written very close to the events described about the end of the Sasanian Empire. So any of your viewers who are interested in Sasanian history as well, hopefully they'll find that useful and interesting. So that's co-authored with Michael Bonner, who's in Canada. And then I've got a research group we're working on. We've got a Gerda Henkel grant to work on group formation in the Abbasid Caliphate. So our question there is, well, many of the things we've been touching on. How do elites justify sub-elites, so the leaders of these different communities? How do they justify their position? How do the communities differ from one another? How do they, in terms of under what conditions do they expand or contract? And how is the pattern of their governance influenced by the wider Abbasid state? And it's trying to think of is there an early Islamic or is there an Abbasid paradigm for the relationships between diverse communities and the state that rules them? So that's our and we're just about to conclude that project with a British Academy funded conference. And then the last thing I'm working on is I'm writing a history at the moment for a trade press for Polity on a history of Christians in the Middle East, and that should be completed over the next 2 years, and that's going to try and do the full run from Jesus to the present day.
Wow.
Sound like a very busy man.
Yeah.
Should be.
And all this talk about minority communities. I know we talked mostly about Christians. Jews were mentioned as well as Manichaeans and Zoroastrians. I'm interested in how Manichaeans and Zoroastrians negotiated terms within the Caliphate. We always talk about Christians and Jews, and rightfully so, as you mentioned. They are put in somewhat of a privileged position from the Quranic text. But yeah, in the Islamic Empire, Zoroastrians and Manichaeans still existed, and I'm wondering how they were able to fare. I mean, the fact that there were Manichaeans and Zoroastrians still existing all the way up into the Abbasid period, maybe even longer. I just want to know how were they able to survive and thrive, and did they engage with Islamic political theory and theology. I know the Zoroastrians, I want to say the Zoroastrians did because they tried to move away from dualist notions to a more monotheistic. But yeah, how these things work out is very interesting.
Yeah, so Christian Zahn recently published a translation of the Skandgumanic Vichar, which is a text allegedly written by a Zoroastrian layman, um, and it's basically, among other things, a critique of monotheism. Um, and it's so he really, for him, the problem of evil is an insoluble problem for monotheists.
Yeah,
Um,
which he kind of has a point. I mean,
I have to say it's extremely it's an extremely interesting read, and he was clearly a very scholarly and clever individual. So and Christian writes a really nice commentary that really opens the text up. So that's a very interesting work, and I think a lot of scholarship on Zoroastrianism, people like Arash Zaini, who's collaborating with our project, is really showing up the degree to which many of the classic texts of Zoroastrianism, if not wholly composed in the Abbasid period, are sort of recomposed, are
mm,
adapted in the Abbasid period, and that they might have sort of imagined Muslim interlocutors as well.
I'm
Um,
curious to know what the motivation behind that, what was the motivation behind that?
yeah, so I think a lot of that is about adapting a tradition that's been developed in the Sasanian period in conversation with Jews and Christians is then adapted to other monotheists. I think that might be going on. For the Manichees, there's much less in terms of extant sources. There's a reader by John Reeves, who collects all the different sources on the Manichees, was published in 2001. I think the last Manichean community in the Islamic world, that at least I'm aware of, is probably in Samarkand in the 10th century.
Mm, all the way to the 10th century.
Yeah, so I think it's probably the Karakhanids destroyed that, or really, eliminate that. But yes, they are periodically persecuted, sometimes very heavily, and they're particularly targeted under al-Mahdi. But of course, the word Zandaka, which is from the
It
Middle
comes from comes from what they described Manichaeans as. I read that in it was an Indonesian scholar. He did a PhD. It was published by Brill. Something about the geographical affiliations or mapping of the companions. Something I can't remember his name off the top of my head, but he mentioned that that word had came about something like 754, seven in the
Well,
mid 700s.
it's a borrowing from Middle Persian, so it's already being used in the Sasanian period,
Mm.
I believe. But you also get specific discussions of people described as Manani, so and that seems to come from Syriac, so people who are using the word itself. Um,
Those indeed didn't doesn't just mean heretic. I mean, when it took on an Islam, when it came into an Islamic context, it came to mean heretic. But before it was what
well,
was
so it's a the word is used to criticize all sorts of deviance, quote unquote. So it's used to describe, people who are too into the Shahnameh, and it's used to describe vegetarians, and it's used to describe homosexuals. So they are all zindig to certain polemicists. So when we see the word, we shouldn't assume that we've got real Manichaeans, but it has this effectiveness because it's associated with a population who is really being persecuted and done and legitimately by the state. By the 10th century, I think we probably don't have any real Manichaeans around in Iraq. And then the word comes to be used to just mean someone who's thinking heretically.
I would definitely fall under the category of Zindiq because of my purchasing of the Shahnameh just a couple days just a couple days ago. So that definitely would fit. But yeah, anything else? I definitely enjoyed speaking with you. Like Roxana mentioned, your book was an easy read. You're an excellent writer. It definitely opened my eyes to an aspect of Islamic history that I had no knowledge about, and I just can't recommend it enough to our audience.
I'm
So
flattered, and thank you for having me on your podcast again. I was wondering if I could say a few words about our MA program in Aga Khan University. Would that be okay?
please,
Absolutely. Yeah, yeah, please do.
So we've been reforming it recently over the past couple of months, and we're going to hope to launch it over the next year or two. And we're aiming to have an embedded internship within the MA program. So it'll be a period of study in London and then finishing with an internship with either within Aga Khan Development Network or with a collaborator, such as Samuel Hall. So probably many of these looking at places like East Africa or Pakistan or maybe Central Asia. So those are our intentions, and then we're also we're reformulating a lot of the program around three themes of social. One is social justice, one is history, data, and policy, and one is climate change and the environment, and trying to look at how these look at these different themes as ways of dealing with threats that face both the Muslim world and the whole world. So that's our new MA program. So we've been launching that over the. We're still in a design phase. So it's not finished anything off yet, and we're still putting it through concept notes. But we hope to have a new MA for everyone in a couple of years.
sounds interesting, and I'll definitely recommend it. If there's anything that you can send us to help promote, we have no problem sharing it on this platform. And it sounds really good.
Cool. Thank you. Thanks very much indeed.
All right, and thank you for joining us on our platform, and we definitely hope to speak to you again.
Thank you. It's been a great pleasure.